So I was a minister for 10 years before I became a mother, having started young in the ministry business. My colleague Angela did it the other way around. Her kids were teens when she was ordained and began her work here as our assistant minister. We both agree that ministry and motherhood have not only coexisted but intersected in our lives, that she learned a lot from being a mother that is helping her in ministry, and that I learned some things in ministry about being a mother, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I didn't actually spend my first years in ministry thinking about everything I learned, oh, how useful that will be when I become a mother, because I didn't think at first I was going to do that. I had been warned that while women did seem to be succeeding in ministry, they didn't seem to be succeeding in combining ministry with marriage or motherhood. It was a long time ago. At my tender age, though, that was fine with me, and I was very focused at first on learning the trade of ministry. But as I look back on those first 10 years of ministry, 8 in Columbia, South Carolina, and 2 here, I realized that many of the lessons did transfer. I began my ministry in Columbia in January, so I'd only lived there for a few months when Mother's Day rolled around, and I discovered that Mother's Day is a big deal holiday in the South. It even came with color-coded lapel flowers. You wore red to honor your living mother and white to honor your deceased mother. I see some of you nodding. I discovered when I moved here that the whole world did not do this. In my mid-Atlantic childhood with rather unsentimental parents, Mother's Day was a day for children to bring home lopsided pots made in school or homemade cards created carefully behind closed bedroom doors. I hadn't actually quite realized that grown-ups celebrated this holiday at all, and the only mention I gave it in church that morning was in the children's story. Sometime in the next week, I got a chatty call from my unofficial ministerial savior, Frances Boozer. She and her husband were both the children of Baptist preachers, and they were the matriarch and patriarch of the Unitarian Fellowship of Columbia. They had opened their home to me when I first arrived and had to look for an apartment and then had to wait for a mislaid moving van for 3 weeks, so we had developed a comfortable relationship. They knew more about ministry than their young minister did, and they also had the skill to convey what they knew without wounding her tender ministerial ego. I imagine now that Frances manufactured some business excuse for this phone call, and then she reminisced about Mother's Day and her father's experience and all the kinds of criticisms her father had received for various treatments of the day, and I hung up making a note to myself that it would be better to address the subject more directly next year. Frances and Howard were parents of 4 girls, all a little older than I. Their patronage of me felt parental, and it worked for me. It's a big reason I survived the very dangerous first 5 years of ministry in a solo pastorate. It's also an example of the ways that the evolutionary forces which have made humans such good parents can permeate all our relationships, and why Mother's Day and Father's Day are not just for biological parents or even for people who've raised children, but for that part of our lives which is involved in nurturing, mentoring, advising, and coaching other human beings of whatever age. Although I wasn't quite aware of all this when it was happening, I do know that I was aware during those years that ministry was also taking mothering energy from me and teaching me about the complexities of caring and nurturing. But I also learned very directly from Howard and Frances about teaching by inference, which came in very handy when my 5-year-old turned out to be one of those have-to-do-it-my-way kids who seem to learn best from indirect feedback and stories about other possible ways of handling a thing. The next year, true to my note to self, I sat down to figure out exactly what I might say in a service honoring mothers, not being one, And I found that I had very mixed emotions about the task. I love my mother dearly, and she was a great mother, but I had to wonder how to balance extolling motherhood with extolling all the other kinds of contributions, especially caring and loving contributions that women make to human beings and human progress. Single and childless myself, I had noted the assumption, especially strong in the South, that mothering was the be-all and end-all of womanhood, and I resented that. Furthermore, I'd come to realize by hearing from the stepmothers and adoptive mothers and even grandmothers that they felt that their contributions to the nurturing of children were left out. In those days, you know, there were only 3 kinds of Mother's Day cards you could buy in card shops. There were cutesy cards from children to their mothers, sentimental cards from adults to their mothers, and cards for religious, read Christian, that's the only kind we thought we had, mothers. Things have changed since then, and for the better. Now you can even buy a card thanking any person of any gender for mothering you. I think that's a good thing. Nurturing that is so important for all of us to grow and thrive. Our mothers may love us in a very special way, but others must love us too. I think I imagined, before I started this career, that ministry was some combination of intellectual pursuits, the reading and writing part, leaderly heroics with committees and community action, and tender moments of pastoral care. I'm sure they teach young ministers more realistic these days, and maybe those rose-colored glasses were more a factor of my 20-somethingness, but it seems to me that most 20-somethings are smarter than that these days, too. But anyway, let's say I had an incomplete picture of the work of ministry. That was that ministry consisted of the fun stuff, the important stuff, and the touching stuff. I had never imagined the nearly daily management of negotiating the desires and needs of individuals with the health and welfare of the community. I had certainly not imagined the time and effort a minister puts into keeping the religious house cleaned up. That first little church in Columbia, they'd purchased a lovely and rather traditional building whose sanctuary was a little too big for them, but which had no storage at all. So they'd gotten in the habit of keeping the extension ladders in the back pews. And you know, it took almost as much effort to get the building committee to figure out how to safely and securely store those ladders outside as it did to raise $300,000 last month. Which reminds me that I never once in my seminary years noticed that ministers have to raise money. But slowly over those first few years of ministry, I came to understand that caring for the institution, its health, its image, and its solvency was at least as important as caring for its people, and that it's always trickier to do and often takes a lot more time. I spent a little time feeling like a victim of bait and switch, and then I got over it. So in the dream of motherhood, of the satisfactions of teaching a little person the skills of adulthood, the heroic work of keeping him safe and healthy, and the tender moments of love and tears, were joined by all that is not talked about quite so much: the negotiation of the needs of different family members and the family as a whole, the limit setting and boundary making, the financial planning and storage problems. I didn't get disillusioned. I'd been here before. I'd come to understand to my bones the importance of the behind-the-scenes work on the health of the whole. I knew I was learning something about motherhood from ministry, and I began to hope I might someday learn something about ministry from motherhood. And I did, but Angela's going to take that part. We'll switch next year. I wanted to say just one more thing about motherhood and ministry, though, which is that I found that these two things went together very well, being a mother and being a ministry. And one of the reasons that they did was that you were a very good family-friendly employer, allowing me the flexibility I needed to be with Kevin when he really needed me, sometimes even helping out with him, and clearly delighting in his growth through the years. And you were a good congregation within which to raise a child also. You kept your promises to all our beloved children, and I thank you.
So I was a mother for about 13 years before I became a minister, having started young in the mothering business. In graduate school, fellow students would often look at my kids and at our heavy course load and say, "I don't know how you can do that." But being a mother is a source of strength and often insight. As I became a minister, I often thought the process and the vocation had a lot in common with my experience of becoming a mother. There was the longing to do it, the waiting to see if it would work out, and the labor, lots of labor, for both vocations. Both involved an identity change. The first time somebody referred to me as my daughter's mother, it sounded crazy. "Are you sure about that?" I wondered. "Or won't the authorities be along shortly to take this little thing away from me?" She seemed too precious to give to somebody who felt so unprepared. Maybe some of the mothers here today remember experiencing that feeling themselves, maybe some dads too. It takes our brains a while to catch up with big life changes, doesn't it? The first time somebody called me Reverend, I burst into laughter. And not just ha, 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 but a belly laugh. You see, I wasn't quite ordained yet, and I thought that the person on the other end of the phone was a friend teasing me. I still had a month to go before my ordination. Unfortunately, it was a member of a search committee from the church. From the church to which I had applied as a minister. And my guffawing at the sound of my own name is probably now one of the stories they tell as they remember finding the minister they did end up hiring. Ministry, like motherhood, is a vocation that becomes your constant companion. When I'm away from my kids, I think of them. When I'm away from this church, I think of you. And not just the great crowd of you, but maybe you personally. You may have noticed that I'm a little slow to recognize faces sometimes, especially if I run into you outside of church. But once I do get to know you, your face will pop into my mind pretty regularly. I care about you. I like you. And that's a good thing, because mothering, like mothering, the demands of ministry can also be unrelenting at times. There's unfinished work at the end of every day. You need values and vision, but you can't be attached to outcomes. And so in ministry, as in mothering, one has to learn to live in the flow of it, and sometimes even just let it wash over you, knowing you won't get a handle on it just then. Come to think of it, all of life is like that, isn't it? Get too caught up checking off your to-do list and thinking of tomorrow and grasping at things that are beyond your control, and before you know it, today will be gone and you will have missed it. Instead, we have to let go of the things we can't control with faith that when change happens, we'll adapt and find a new normal. Find a new normal. I worked as a doula for a while, supporting mothers during childbirth. And at the postpartum visit, when the weary parents would look at me with disbelief that this is how the human race has flourished, with so little sleep and such utterly dependent babies, I would tell them to try not to worry too much. Although their old lives were gone, pretty soon they'd find a new normal, and everything would start to feel okay again. In ministry, I often encounter people facing other kinds of life changes, not all of them welcome. Most of us would not seek out a new normal of our own volition. We do it because an old normal has been swept away. We have to find our feet again, but it's a time of unexpected possibility. Like mothering, ministry changed my identity, and like mothering, it also changed my relationship with my husband, and it changed him, too. He's married to a member of the clergy, for heaven's sake. He did not see that coming. Gone are any illusions he might have had about the venerable ministers of his youth. One day he came home to find me sitting in front of my laptop and a whole bag of Oreos, eating one cookie after another in my pajama pants at 6 p.m. and shouting, "Don't talk to me, I'm in the zone." As I worked on the next day's sermon, I could see him imagining a new side to the Catholic priests of his childhood, as a look of incredulity crossed over his face. and now perhaps yours as well. Ministers like cookies. With pregnancy came morning sickness. With the path to ministry came the nervous stomach. One day when I was an intern minister, in charge of 2 worship services for the first time, for the same congregation that inspired Ralph Waldo Emerson's scathing criticism of religion back in the 1850s. I was so nauseous with anxiety, I actually hid a plastic bag in the pulpit, just in case. It isn't that bad anymore. But I do still get nervous. I want to honor your hearts and your minds and your time with the words that I speak up here. And when you care deeply about something, you feel it. And when you care deeply about something, you learn from it. Becoming a mother changed the way I saw strangers. They were babies once, I realized. I remember the day a stern-faced woman in a grocery store snapped at my 3-year-old son for wandering in front of her cart. "Watch where you're going," she growled at him. "Hey," I told her, "he's just a little kid." "My parents would never have let me walk in front of somebody like that," she scolded me. "Well," I said, "you sure turned out mean." It was probably the only time I've ever thought of a smart comeback right in the moment. But you know, afterward, my main feeling was not one of satisfaction. It was curiosity. What kind of parents did she have? When did she become bitter? Is she always like that, or was she having terrible pain or terrible luck that day? What would it have been like if I had responded to her crankiness with unexpected kindness? Likewise, being a minister has also changed the way I see strangers. Once, when I was a hospital chaplain intern, I noticed a miserable-looking man lying alone in a big hospital room, and I introduced myself from the doorway and asked if I could come in. Speaking in a really soft voice, he told me that no one could figure out what was wrong with him. He was having unrelenting nausea, the kind that dominates every second of your thinking. He'd never experienced anything like this before, and he felt he wasn't coping very well. He wasn't the praying type, and I sure didn't have any answers for him. But remembering an old trick from pregnancy and labor, I got a cold washcloth for the back of his neck. It offered just enough relief for his face to relax a bit, and he looked a little emotional as he thanked me. A couple of minutes later, I left and I went to enter my visit into his medical chart at the nurse's station, where I saw what I suspect was the reason the other staff were keeping their distance. The man was a high-ranking physician in town and was director of a whole department at another institution. Treating him must have been really intimidating, and it was lucky that I was so clueless, because I think he just needed some simple compassion in that moment. He was only human. We all are. He was someone's baby once. We all were. When I became a mother, I realized that my mother was just a human being who had been living out life's questions in front of my sister and me. As my kids grew into toddlerhood, I saw that I was not more perfect than my mother had been, and that I, too, was living out life's questions in front of my children. They watch us. Often they're like little mirrors. I see this in the way they occasionally blurt out expletives or give me attitude. And I see it in the sweet and funny ways that they are there for each other when, for whatever reason, I can't be. On the occasion of my ordination, my mentor, the Reverend Gary Smith, preached the sermon. In it, he tried to describe to me and my family and the congregation what it was I was being called to. Angela will still be a human being living out the same questions we all are, he said, only she will be living them out publicly. And so for you, as for my children, I pray that I can do it in a way that will be of use, and that it will help you to be present to your own lives and there for each other and for the stranger, as you already are in so many ways. May it be so. Happy Mother's Day.